Hi, my name is Pat, and this is my channel, Book Chat with Pat, and I'm glad that you're here. I want to thank my subscribers and viewers who have been so supportive of my first episode in this new series on the books I loved to teach. I so appreciate the comments that many of you left me on my episode 1 on the Green Mile. For my second episode, I'd like to talk about Tim O'Brien's novel, The Things They Carried, about young men serving in the Vietnam War, a book that I taught to seniors in high school in a course on contemporary fiction. Tim O'Brien was drafted into the Army in 1968 and served as a foot soldier in the 46th Infantry in Vietnam until 1970, when he was hit by shrapnel from a hand grenade, awarded the Purple Heart, and sent home. This book was published in 1990, 20 years after O'Brien returned from his tour of duty. The Things They Carried defies categorization as a work of literature. It is a collection of 22 stories, but there are characters who recur throughout the collection. And while the stories can be read as individual, separate stories, they actually fit together with recurring characters and themes and symbols to describe the wartime experiences of a group of very young men. Critics debate about whether it's a collection of stories, a novel, or even a memoir. Some think that it is a memoir, because, at least part memoir, because many of the events depicted in the collection are events that Tim O'Brien himself experienced. There's also a character in the collection and a narrator of many of the stories named Tim O'Brien. But there are also things that happen to the character Tim O'Brien that were not in the author Tim O'Brien's actual lifetime experiences. So there's a large debate about exactly how to categorize the book. And indeed, I think a central idea that O'Brien is asking us to consider is how storytelling can help us to get at the truth, to get at real life experience, particularly in times of war. Teaching the book in the 21st century to students for whom the Vietnam War seemed like very distant history, if not ancient history, could be very challenging. It was often necessary to provide a great deal of background information on U.S. involvement in Vietnam, as well as responses to the war at home, particularly on college campuses, before we could even think about reading the collection. The last year I taught this book, however, I had a student who was a passionate student of history, and particularly of this time period in history. In addition to having read widely about the Vietnam era, he had also watched and really studied the entire Ken Burns 10-part PBS documentary series, The Vietnam War. So I appointed him as our resident expert on all things related to Vietnam, deferred to him when questions came up about Vietnam, and in short, gave him a real opportunity to shine. One of the most moving stories in the collection is the first and title story, The Things They Carried. This is a story written in the third person. It introduces several of the characters, though, who are featured in the later stories. But it focuses largely on one character, Jimmy Cross, the platoon leader. Jimmy is infatuated with a girl back home, Martha, a girl with whom he actually has had only one real date. But she continues to write to him. She sends him friendly letters, and he reads and rereads these letters and obsesses over the possibility, of what might be with Martha at some point. His distraction with Martha will have very serious consequences later in the story. Next, we get a description of each of the men in the platoon and a litany of the things that each one carried. We learn, of course, about all of the standard things that every foot soldier carries and their functions. But then the narrator moves into a description of particular things, personal things that each man carried. And these things begin to define each of the other characters as individuals. Each object takes on a deeper meaning for that person and for our understanding of his character. For instance, one man carries extra food, another carries extra personal hygiene products, another carries a diary, one carries tranquilizers, another comic books sent to him from home, and yet another carries his copy of the New Testament of the Bible. Each object helps to define the soldier's character, and some of these objects recur in later stories. Then the narrator goes even deeper by continuing to describe what the men carry emotionally: superstitions, dreams, anxieties, machismo, pride, bravery, humor, fear, guilt, shame, all kinds of emotional baggage. The emotional baggage that they carried, especially fear and shame that they really aren't as brave as they're trying to appear. This emotional baggage is as heavy as the physical loads that they are carrying. Students are always very moved by this opening story as they analyze how the author moves the reader from the concrete things that soldiers carry to the more abstract, emotional, and symbolic. Very early in my teaching career, I studied with a brilliant teacher named Emily Stile through her work with the Dodge Foundation. And from Emily, I learned early on about the importance of curriculum serving as both window and mirror. Curriculum should open up windows to experiences outside a student's own life experience. But it also needs to serve in some way as a mirror for students' life experience. Students need representation in the curriculum, and they need ways to make a personal connection to what is being studied if the learning is to be meaningful, even when the subject matter is very remote from their own lives. The kids that I taught were largely upper middle class kids on their way to college who would, for the most part, probably not see military experience in their lives. They probably did think that Vietnam had very little to do with their life experience. A writing assignment that I designed early on in the unit to help my students to connect to this book revolved around the central idea of the concrete and abstract things that we all carry. I wrote my own version first as a model, the things that I carry. And I shared it with my students. And then I asked them to write one. Students wrote their own versions of the things that they carried. Every one of them could identify with the idea that we all carry physical seen baggage and emotional unseen baggage as well. Many students did some of the best writing that they did all year on this writing assignment. These were, again, seniors in high school on the cusp of leaving home and going off to college. On the surface, they appeared to have all of the advantages of comfortable upper middle class lives. Under the surface, they carried all kinds of complicated emotions, like kids anywhere. They described what they carried in their heavy backpacks. They described jewelry that they wore that had special meaning. They described sports equipment that they lugged to and from school every day. And they wrote about the hopes that they carried for their futures after high school, and also about the pressures that they felt and their anxieties and worries for their lives, for the lives of their family, for the lives of their younger siblings, for their future lives in college, as they used to say, outside the bubble of our little town, their lives beyond high school. The novel contains many central themes. One is certainly the harsh realities of war. Another theme revolves around the pressures that each character faces, first in deciding whether or not to serve, and later in deciding how to conduct themselves as soldiers. O'Brien, opposed to the war, almost flees to Canada early in the work, but he ultimately decides to serve. His reasons for deciding to serve, though, are not what you would imagine. Another theme revolves around the necessity of having a personal moral code in one's life. The novel also deals with ideas about truth and fiction, as I mentioned before, and the importance of storytelling. It's sometimes hard to discern what is true and what is made up, and kids are sometimes frustrated by this. Ultimately, I think that O'Brien is saying that his stories help him to objectify his own experience. It's a way to separate the experience from himself, and it's a way to give voice to those who didn't survive. Stories, O'Brien shows us, whether absolutely factual or not, are the best way to communicate wartime experiences because of the feelings that they engender in the reader. I used to wrap up the study of the novel with a creative project that included about a dozen options. Students would also write an essay to go along with their project, and they would do a presentation of their project to the entire class. Some of the best projects that I saw were these. A particularly artistic young woman painted a series of paintings inspired by the stories. Another student analyzed the music of war protest from the 60s and 70s and related it to specific stories in the collection. A group of students wrote a script and performed a scene of a therapy session between one of the characters who survived and suffered from PTSD and his therapist, complete with flashbacks from the action acted out. Yet another student wrote a collection of poetry inspired by the stories. Another created a graphic novel based on a couple of the stories. Another wrote a series of letters home in the voice of a recurring character. Each project, as I said, had an accompanying essay that described the important ideas from the novel that they were attempting to represent in their projects. The projects where students created something new from their understanding of the themes of the novel told me that they understood Tim O'Brien's book in a deep and meaningful way. So that's another example of a book that I loved to teach, one that I think challenged my students, and one which I think ultimately they understood on a deep level. I will have more to come in this series soon. As always, I thank you for watching. I hope that you're doing well. I'll speak with you again soon. Take care.